I'm Isabelle Gonthier, Chief Assessment Officer at PSI Services, and I invite you to delve deep into the world of testing with me. Every episode, I'll be on the virtual couch with experts from the testing industry, engaging in conversations about the latest developments in our field. Your quest for testing knowledge starts here. Well, welcome to our Tried and Tested podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of receiving Helen Coleman. She's a Chief Operating Officer at ABRSM, and we're going to be talking about embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion in assessment. And we're here in the London office. So welcome to our podcast, Helen.
Thank you, and welcome to our offices here in Moorgate in London.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if the audience can actually see in the background, but we are in one of the music room here, and in the back we have a grand piano because this is used to test young apprentices, if I can put it that way.
Yes, so our candidates all come here for some of their performance-based exams and sit in these very rooms and be assessed by their examiner.
Yeah, no, this is great. It's great to be here and to be able to have this conversation with you, Helen.
No, thanks for inviting me.
Perfect. So we always, I always say the same thing, but we always start the podcast with a similar question for our participants, and it's about sharing your background. So how did you get involved in assessment and credentialing? What's your story?
Okay, so my story, I have to say, I didn't kind of go to school and then college and think this is where I want to end up in terms of the industry. It was probably an industry I'd never heard of before. But I looked back, reflecting on this conversation. It's been almost 30 years now since I started my journey. I started work actually in a further and higher education college. And I was working on the kind of exam side of delivering exams in the college. But I was keen to better understand what happened in terms of producing them before they came to the college and what happened once they'd left the college and the candidate had completed their script. So I then took a graduate role at an exam awarding organisation based in London that delivered GCSEs, A-levels and BTEC vocational qualifications in the UK and internationally. And through that role, I had the opportunity to work across the assessment life cycle, but I moved to specialise very much in test development in terms of the content, the production, and then getting it out to the candidates. At that point in my career, Pearson acquired the organisation I worked for, so we then kind of had quite a lot more assessment expertise and kind of experience to work with. And I took responsibility for delivering all of the post-16 qualifications for Pearson internationally as well as in the UK, including its early moves into on-screen assessment and also producing modified tests for candidates. Quite a long journey in that space, and I moved here to ABRSM about 7 years ago. And for those who aren't familiar with who we are, we're the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music. We're an awarding organisation based in London, and we offer music assessments and supporting products and services globally in now almost 100 countries. And as the Chief Operating Officer, I'm responsible for the end-to-end delivery of all of our qualifications. The challenges that COVID brought with it in 2020 led to us delivering new digital online assessments and to us working with yourselves. And I know we would have moved to those assessments in time, but probably not as quickly as we ended up moving. I'm really proud of what we've managed to achieve in partnership with others in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's great to be able to talk a bit about what we've done and how we've done it.
Yeah, absolutely. I liked your story and your journey because it sounds very purposeful in terms of your evolution in the industry, your objectives, what you wanted to do and accomplish, and having looked at all aspects of the continuum of learning and assessment. So that's a very interesting path that you took, and then really kind of built on the building blocks to kind of allow you to be where you are now and have an impact in a way. So appreciate that. And I think it's interesting to hear, what you've said about ABRSM and what you're doing. And again, the global impact that you have. And it's a great segue in terms of the conversation we're having about equity, diversity, and inclusion, because when you think about the test taker population that you work with, when you think about the types of assessments you have, those are really important consideration. And you've mentioned it as well with the transition through COVID. COVID pushed a lot of organizations in terms of having to be creative and think about different modalities for assessment to continue to be able to assess. But again, a link to it, equity, diversity, and inclusion is there as well in terms of access when you think about your global population.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah. And what's really interesting as well is, and I want to take a moment to thank you, because we had the opportunity to do a couple of conference presentations together back in June at the EEA Assessment Conference here in London, and then most recently at the EATP Conference in Berlin. And through those conference presentations, we had a chance to really unpack a little bit more elements around, yes, what are the key considerations for ED&I for exam programs, but specifically leverage your experience and what you've done with ABRSM. So it's really thinking about how we've highlighted the importance of embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion in the assessment, and then being able to share on that. So reflecting on the conversations we had and being able to provide visibility to our audience here about some of those considerations. Why do you think ED&I has become such a critical focus in today's assessment landscape?
Well, reflecting on the question very much from the point of view of, quite rightly, EDI has become a critical focus in many parts of our everyday lives. And more and more organisations, therefore, have started to recognise the importance of EDI to their customers, to their employees, and to their stakeholders. And if assessment organisations are going to remain relevant, then they are no different, and we need to respond to that challenge as well. And for me, good assessment has always been about allowing the candidates to demonstrate what they know, what they can do, how they can do it, rather than creating barriers and hurdles for candidates who they can't get over them, and then as a result, not able to demonstrate success. So for me, embedding EDI into assessment is just an absolute extension of that belief. So the fewer hurdles a candidate has to jump through just to access a fair assessment, the better from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's critical. And the reference to the barriers is really critical here, because we want to make sure in the end, we want to make sure that we're assessing what needs to be assessed, not the ability of people of navigating through complex circumstances. There's a very set knowledge, skills, and ability that are set out for the assessment, and we need to provide the opportunity for everyone to be able to demonstrate their skills.
Yes,
absolutely.
Definitely.
So when we think about how organizations are navigating those considerations around ED&I, and we think about language, cultural differences, localization, those key concepts when we're looking at creating inclusive assessment, what are the challenges that are commonly encountered in these efforts as we look at assessment design?
So, as I said earlier, we operate in almost 100 countries. So being a global music assessment provider, considerations of language, cultural differences and localization are fundamental to us being successful and delivering successful assessments. So English is not the first language of many of our candidates, but it is the first language of the majority of our examiners. So we do all we can to ensure rubrics are in plain and concise English as possible. And we do provide translations. So we provide translations in for our exams for our largest cohorts. So for us, that is Chinese, both traditional and simplified, Spanish, Italian, and USA English as well, because there are different ways of thinking about specific musical terms in the US compared to UK and Europe. And so in providing the language changes, they help increase accessibility for candidates who study outside the UK. We have prioritised the largest cohorts, which you'd expect. But for me, it would be absolutely great in the future to be able to provide assessments in whatever language the candidate needs to be able to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding. So that to me is something I'd love to be able to do. When we moved our music theory exams on screen from the paper-based that we had, previously we had quite complex and narrative style of questioning, and that to me often provided a barrier to understanding. You might know the answer, but if you haven't understood the question, you can't demonstrate that you do. So actually we took the very kind of intentional decision to move to using objective test questions. And so for us in doing that, again, with a global audience, it ensured that the style and the way that we had to frame the questions and work carefully to make them as clear as possible allowed our non-English candidates to not be disadvantaged by that language barrier, but also for us from a kind of wider access point of view, that those whose cognitive demand perhaps is not as great in the English language or was still in development, which for us young learners are a considerate population, and also the neurodiverse, we were making the questions as accessible as possible, and so that's important for us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great that you've sort of evolved the assessment to take into account those considerations and being more inclusive and providing that opportunity. And I'm sure it required a lot of work in terms of stepping back, reassessing what are we evaluating here? What's the purpose of the assessment? What's the best way to assess?
Right.
And then define and design accordingly.
Yes, very much so. I mean, when we looked to change the assessment from its written format, we actually pulled together a wide-ranging stakeholder group representing all sorts of ages, stages, geographies, experiences, different parts of their musical journey to inform us as we piloted different versions of the new tests before we even moved to putting it, formally on screen and delivered across the globe. And it was important to us to get that feedback about what worked, what didn't work, what felt accessible, what didn't feel accessible from a range of different people. So it was really great to be able to involve the wider stakeholder population rather than just our subject matter experts in making those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really critical from two angles is around the buy-in. When you engage more broadly, then people are informed and know and understand what you're trying to accomplish, the reasons, the purpose, and they're engaged in the process. So it's easier then for them to embark into and consider positively the changes that are being proposed. But also from an ED&I standpoint, having the diversity, a representative sets of different types of stakeholders at different points in their journey and all of that is also critical, because we've talked about the assessment itself and the design, but who's engaged in creating those assessments, defining what needs to be assessed is critical throughout the journey. And then what you've just described is a great illustration of that in terms of the engagement from a diversity standpoint, but also from an engagement standpoint.
And now a short break. Hello, tried and tested listeners and fellow testing enthusiasts. I'm Isabelle Gonthier, your guide through the fascinating world of credentialing. Each week, we dive deep with expert guests to explore the hottest topics in certification and licensure testing. If you're enjoying our journey through lifelong learning and innovation, take a moment to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. And if you know someone passionate about testing or curious about the latest testing trends, why not share this podcast with them? It might just be the inspiration they need. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our community. Remember, sharing knowledge is one of the best ways to grow our industry together. Keep listening.
As we consider, and think about the ABRSM's journey, what would be some of the key lessons learned and challenges that were faced in embedding some of the EDI principles? And how did you overcome those challenges?
So the example I was going to use here that I think kind of speaks to this was actually not about the test itself, but how we were providing the test. And we, for our music theory assessments, use a recorded review service for our assessments. And this is predominantly because the majority of our learners are between 8 and 14. It would be it's more appropriate for them not to be being observed live by an adult. And also felt like, less intrusive, more, introductory from their point of view, and so that they could potentially take their exam at home rather than having to, head to a test centre that might be quite overwhelming and scary. But having taken that decision from a kind of practical standpoint and a safeguarding standpoint, we then had to start thinking more about some EDI considerations as well that kind of said, well, how are we going to implement this? And so in order for us to be effective in delivering this record and review arrangement, we had to create the role of a responsible adult. So this is somebody who sits with the candidate whilst it's being set up and accessed by a minor. And this would typically be a parent or a carer or a music teacher. And that could be at home, in another setting, or even at school. So we had to consider that, and then we had to brief everybody to be able to do that, to know, what is this role? I've never heard of it. And then in working with the proctors, who were at the other side of the record and review process, we needed to work with them to brief them very specifically in terms of not just what to look out for, but to expect a range of behaviours from minors. So somebody between 6 and 14, 8 and 14, it may well be their very, very first online assessment that they've ever taken. And therefore their behaviours, whilst being observed in the record and review video, could be quite different. And so we had to make sure that the proctors were prepared and aware of that, so that we were not flagging things unduly, but also so that we could provide a full briefing back to the candidate and to those supporting them about what to expect from a record and review session, because we wanted it to feel as comfortable as possible, something that most people at that age had never done before. Yeah. So really, how do we make it as accessible and communicate its accessibility to encourage people to feel comfortable to sit the exam? So something that kind of felt like a very practical thing, we're going to move to this, suddenly became, how do we make sure the person who's going to experience this is not confused or uncomfortable by the experience that they have? So again, they can focus on the matter in hand, which is, what do I know? What can I tell the examiner that is important that I need to demonstrate?
Yeah, and alleviate or minimize the stress as much as possible about the modality. Yep. And if you don't mind, I want to unpack that a little bit more, because you've described the importance for both the test taker and the proctor, the reviewer at the end. What are some of the tools that you've developed? I'm assuming that there was a learning process as well, in terms of defining candidate handbooks, specific tools, in order to get your candidates familiarized, help them be ready for that modality. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those tools that you've developed?
Sure. So I would suggest probably at the end of the journey now, we've got some great tools now, and some of them are actually just videos of demonstrating what things look like, so people get a chance to play them in advance. Maybe the responsible adult sits down with the candidate in advance, they watch it together, and a bit of a question and answer session from that point of view. One of the things we've had to do is provide a handbook of kind of a glossary of terms because actually the term proctor is not a typically used term that often in the UK. It would normally be invigilator, but obviously we're not invigilating, it's proctoring in the sense of how it's being done.
It's different.
And so explaining that so that people understood it and unpacking the language so it became accessible as well is really important. So guidance in the terms of a handbook, very much. Also, as I think, working through with the proctor reviewer team in terms of, well, we think this is what we're going to want to flag, and let's get their insight in terms of what have they seen, is that right? And we regularly then go back with that team to kind of reflect on how are we doing that? Are we seeing anything different? And as an example, at the moment, the thing that we're seeing lots of people doing is wearing hats and headsets in their exams at the moment. That could be the time of year for the Northern Hemisphere, who knows? But again, now we're going to have to brief that back out to our population taking the exam so that they know that that's not an acceptable thing. But I wouldn't have previously thought that I needed to tell somebody not to wear a hat because they could hide headphones potentially in their exams.
Yeah, absolutely.
Communication, I think, is key, and that's not just about whether you're considering anything to do with EDI, but definitely making sure that people are feeling as comfortable and as well briefed as they possibly can. And we're always looking to see what other resources we can make available on our website and on our social media channels that people can access in advance of the exams to really support them. Because often people are taking their exam not connected to an education institution, so their support is coming largely from a parent or a carer.
Yeah, so they need to be, to have access to material information to help them and assist them in the process. And one thing that you've mentioned that I find extremely important and I really want to highlight is the fact that it's never said and done. There's always new things coming up, showing up, and being able to adapt the material, continue to develop tools to really help and assist the test takers is important. And there's new things that are going to come up. So then you need to adjust, communicate, reset, refocus, reframe in a way. And from the moment you've introduced the modality to now, you've learned a lot. Your test taker population has learned a lot. Even, us as partners have learned a lot as well in terms of how to work with the population, the types of examination. And that collaboration is critical because in the end, it makes it, you mentioned it, more accessible and then a more powerful approach and tool.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, that's great. When we think about, obviously, technology is having like a massive impact on opportunities. Again, when we think about ED&I and what it means from an assessment. So are there specific innovative approaches or technologies that could help organization in, from that sense, in advancing the way we do assessments with that kind of umbrella and EDI approach into consideration?
Well, I'm certainly no technologist, but I'm also well aware that the use of AI is definitely going to provide opportunities, whether it's to generate different types of assessment, ones that are more interactive, more interesting, perhaps more likely to engage the candidate, but ones that perhaps go beyond knowledge and application and the traditional multiple choice that we currently use. I'm sure that there'll be opportunities. And as an awardee organisation that provides music assessments, it's quite a niche area. There aren't a lot of partners that specialise in delivering music assessments, so we're always kind of on the lookout for who could we work with and who might want to look at supporting music assessment. At ABRSM ourselves, we're in the early stages of looking how we can leverage machine learning in relation to all the performance data we hold and how we might be able to do something with that. No guarantees that we will, but actually we recognise that we have a lot of data that is about how people perform when they are in a music assessment. So how could we use it to inform something to be better at? And it may well have an EDI standpoint in terms of how we do it. We don't know yet. But I think that's kind of the point, isn't it? To kind of keep an open mind, to be engaging, with others to find out how we might look for solutions to be better at our assessments.
And what you said about the data and how to leverage that huge data set that you have and leveraging technology and machine learning to help in terms of parsing out that data, identifying trends, I think is really important because that is the power now of some of those tools that before it's hard. It's hard to kind of do in-depth analyses and really identify the trends. It takes time. But now there's ways of really identifying those trends. You've mentioned around the performance that could help guide across the continuum of learning and assessment. Obviously, we're focusing on assessment because we're establishing, we need to establish if people meet the requirements to earn a credential or a diploma or a grade of some sort. But looking at that performance data can help inform what needs to be assessed, how it can be assessed, and some of the learning steps in the way to help in the journey from start to finish. So that's a great observation there.
And I think just keeping open-minded, you referenced, again, a couple of conferences that we did earlier in the year together. There was lots of people there who were very keen to talk about the role of AI in assessment, or the potential role of AI in assessment. And it's about engaging with that and to hearing what people might say and making connections to identify opportunities, because I think that opportunity pool is just going to get deeper and wider.
Yeah. And then staying current and relevant and partnering with organizations that can support that growth and opening up on the opportunities and perspective is so important as well, because it's about establishing a strategy, having a strategy, identifying the opportunities and see how you can leverage. And organizations will move at a different pace. It's to be expected. But, doing something and trying to better understand, to evolve within that technology/AI landscape is what's really important, because if we don't, we're going to be left behind, and nobody wants that. So it's pushing the limits a little bit, but at the same time, it just creates and open up so many opportunities. And you mentioned it also in terms of different types of assessments. To me, when I think about AI and generative AI, that's where I see where there's the most potential, because we can look at ways of integrating and being more adaptive in the evaluation process, instead of having a fixed set assessment, based on how the response are framed, the level, the skill level, adapt and make it more interactive. Leveraging some of the technologies is a massive opportunity here.
Definitely.
How do you see the role of awarding organizations that evolving? When you think about, we just talked about technology, innovations, and all that, but thinking about the evolution of the roles within the next 5 to 10 years, what would you say are sort of the key things to consider, and how do we make sure that those organizations, your organization, but other awarding bodies, are staying at the forefront of inclusivity and also innovation in assessments, kind of combining a little bit of the two things?
It is, and you don't want to have one or the other. So how do you combine inclusivity and innovation? And I think some of the ways that AI and related technologies will start to embed themselves more greatly with awarding organisations is absolutely how we'll do it. But we've got to keep in mind that anything that we do means that the candidates are still continue to be assessed as fairly and as supportively as they can be. For me, perhaps you'd expect this from somebody who sits in a COO chair, but the underlying challenge of the cost to serve always sits there. But for me, the more that we can find innovative ways to embed inclusivity into our assessments from the start of the assessment life cycle is the best way to attend to this. So one of the key indicators of success would be a reduction in the number of requests from candidates to modify how they assess or sit an exam because their specific need has been baked into the assessment by design. So rather than us having each year reports of thousands of people who asked to do an exam in a slightly different way to how it was intended, but that they all sit the exam as intended because their needs had already been designed into the assessment. So assessment by fair design, for me, is kind of a really powerful consideration of how we might be able to innovate, but bring inclusivity to the forefront of how we're using that innovation for detailed and strong assessments that are as flexible as they can be for people's needs.
Yeah, and I think that element of looking at it more from being proactive as opposed to reactive, I think is very important and powerful. And that whole concept of embedding all of those key principles in the early stage will reduce the need, to your point, you know, when you think about those testing accommodations. Obviously, there's always going to be some needs of adapting for certain, you know, for certain people, target populations. But if the design are based on the key considerations, it would minimize and reduces the needs from a testing accommodation standpoint.
Yes, and it means that the candidate knows what support they're going to get from the outset, not what support can we kind of bring together that might be okay and it might be quite close to the time that they're going to do the exam. And so that in itself raises stress levels. Am I going to get the support I need? Well, actually, I know I am, because this exam has been designed with mine and others' needs from the outset. And that's quite a powerful statement to make back to candidates, to feel confident that this is the right assessment for them as well, because they feel confident that they've been represented in the needs that have been addressed in the design.
Yeah, so as organizations evolve and think through those considerations, I think it's important. So when in the outlook, looking forward in terms of the future years, the embedding of those considerations early on is critical. Because honestly, I think that it's done to a certain extent, but I don't think there's necessarily the focus that we could see and we potentially should see. So those are like important to highlight.
Yes, and it's always easier to do it if you're starting a new qualification or a new set of assessments, but we say that it's easier, but it's only easier if you make a conscious choice to make sure that you embed EDI into your assessment. Because if you just create a new set of assessments and then you start down the path and then you decide to embed EDI, it's going to be more challenging. But often, we don't have that luxury because assessments have been running for a long period of time, and so we continue to iterate them or augment them. That doesn't mean it's wrong to do it, and it's better to do something rather than nothing, and then keep pushing the boundaries of what you do. But yes, if anybody's looking to kind of put out new and updated assessments, then absolutely make sure that EDI has been considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, I think it's definitely easier when you think about a new program. But even with an existing program, I think there's an opportunity to step back and in a way, like being brave to kind of say, we might need to rethink this.
Yes.
We might need to kind of flip it around. And as part of the assessment life cycle, there's opportunity through like a job task analysis or a role delineation study to redefine, okay, what are we assessing for what purpose? And oftentimes organizations are, yes, going through the process, they're making changes to make sure that what's assessed is current. But there's not as much conversation, and I kind of like, I might be a little controversial here, but there's not as much focus on, do we need to rethink the assessment? And I think it's a question we need to ask more and more and more. It is challenging and it's a scary thought because everything that is built based on a specific process and approach. But it provides opportunities to kind of reset a little bit. So it's a balancing act, though. It's absolutely a balancing act. And then sometimes changes might be a little bit more like, phased in and a bit at a time. But there's opportunities to question and reset based on how things are evolving. So, I'll challenge our audience to think through some of that as well, to say how can they rethink the approach and process?
Well, definitely, because, our stakeholders are going to want it to be as accessible as possible. And if you've failed to demonstrate much progress, then they'll probably look elsewhere as well. Is there another program that is doing it in a way that feels like my needs are being considered?
Yeah. From a competitive standpoint, absolutely, there's lots of great arguments to be made. But also, again, when you think about the whole concept of fairness, it's just so paramount. Yeah. What would be some advice that you would give to organizations that are beginning their journey? They're thinking about embedding ED&I into their assessments, and what should they prioritize, when they're thinking about it?
So, as I said, if you don't have the luxury of starting from scratch, then do make sure that you're doing something and it's the right things. And I would also say, make sure you've sense checked the right things with your key stakeholders. I referenced earlier the fact that when we were moving our tests to on screen, we brought together a consultative group that were representing a whole range of needs, so that they were part of the program of change that we had. So it wasn't just being done within the confines of us as an organisation. So I would, if you've got advisory boards, advisory groups that are relevant to EDI requirements, then I'd absolutely get them on board and get them working with you. And pilot and iterate as much as you can. Get that feedback. Is this working? Is it addressing the need or the requirement that you thought it was going to do? And communicate if you can. If you've made a plan and you intend to move from where you are now to somewhere better that you hope that will come, then communicate to your stakeholder groups, to your customers, that things are coming. There may be things that you have to do quicker than you might want to, because it's an absolute requirement in order to make to demonstrate fairness going forward. But start the journey, plan it, and make sure you communicate that great stuff that you're planning on doing, and then tell people when you've done it and measure it afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think those are great pieces of advice. And I would say as well, like there's so many great resources out there as well. Lots of, we've talked about industry conferences, that there are great opportunities to have conversations with other organizations, with experts that are working and really kind of looking from an assessment standpoint, looking at those considerations, thinking through those considerations, researching on that. So leveraging that expertise and getting engaged from that too is
definitely, it's not something you have to solve on your own. Yeah. Most people you'll speak to in this arena want to make things more accessible, better, fairer. Therefore, we're all keen to work to make that happen. So there are always allies to find and work with.
Absolutely. Nobody's alone in this. So we're all we're a massive community from an assessment and testing standpoint. So leveraging that. Yeah, that's great. Well, it's been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate the time that you've given us to be part of this podcast, share your expertise, your journey with ABRSM, but also your own journey. There's a lot of great nuggets here in the conversation that I know will be very, very useful to our audience. So thank you for your time on that.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you.